1 Corinthians 11, and verse 2, verse 16. We'll be looking at a few verses tonight as Paul breaks out this section according to the way a worship service should go. And really it doesn't end until the last of chapter 14. But in this section, start in verse 2 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and end at verse 16. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Pretty easy section, right? So it's not hard to see how out of all the Pauline corpus, all the Pauline writings, this is probably one of the hardest to interpret. This passage ranks as one of the most difficult to really understand in their time, and also in hermeneutics you describe the bridging the gap. So you have to try and understand what they're going through in their time. How do we bridge the gap to make this applicable for us today? Because this is a hard passage to do that with. Without just a preliminary reading, it's very hard to make that into something that we apply today. It's definitely done, and we'll do it, but just a preliminary reading of it, it's very difficult. In just a few verses, 15 verses, Paul touches on gender, angels, creation, distinctions among genders, the relationship between God the Son and God the Father, head coverings, prayer, prophecy, and hair length. And he does all of that in 15 short verses. Obviously, one of the most challenging aspects of this passage is the cultural implications. The gap between Corinth and ours is very wide, because we're not a culture that practices head coverings. We're not a culture that practices veiling. And when it mentions here head coverings, I don't think it's not referring to necessarily as just something that I've seen it before, and there's actually a movement in some Reformed churches where the woman wears, it almost looks like a dolly over her head. And I know in some churches, even in America, it's more proper for a woman to wear a hat, or, there's like in maybe some African American congregations, some women will have the really big hats and everything like that. And that's where it kind of applies to that as well. But when Paul refers to head coverings, it's more appropriate to think of it not as a head covering, just something that goes over the head, but it's more appropriate to think of it as an entire veil, as something that covers most of your head. So according to the Greek, it's not just one thing that goes over the head, but think of it more like, if you're familiar with Muslim practices, think of it like a veil, like a hijab. It's something that more goes over and covers most of your face. And in their time, depending on the context and the service, it probably would cover your mouth and nose, and probably your eyes are the only thing that's seen there. And that's what's culturally practiced there at that time. So this isn't just necessarily a head covering, but it's a veil. And we don't practice veiling. I mean, it's not something that we regularly practice. And even in all those examples that I gave, none of them practice veiling. The only time in our culture which we have veiling is, of course, of a different religion. We may see that custom wherever we go. You may see it more in St. Louis or places like that, Chicago, bigger cities. But during weddings, whenever we have a wedding, the bride will be veiled. But even that's kind of not becoming the normal practice. The weddings that I've done, usually it's whoever's giving them away and then lift the veil, give it to her, or the husband lifts the veil. Out of those weddings, I've never been to one where actually that was practiced. And I can't remember whether
our own.
That was our own where we did that?
My dad did ours.
Okay, yeah. So that's the only one that I've been to where that's even kind of becoming not a cultural norm anymore. And so it's just hard for us to understand that. We don't have a culture that veils. We don't have a culture that is the regular practice. So we're going to have to work really hard to try and grasp at what the apostle is writing about. And it's not just cultural comments, because the apostle makes this difficult to interpret, as Paul writes that some things in here, it's not just the cultural norms, but it's also the way that Paul writes. It's difficult because Paul applies things from the Genesis account, and then he says that there's angels going on, and then he says that nature teaches it's a disgrace for one to have long hair, for one not to have long hair, and so there's a lot of things going on here. It's not just veiling, but it's also all these other things. But I'm encouraged. It may seem like it can be discouraging after this, but I'm encouraged because we're in good company that we don't understand fully what's going on. Because even Peter, another apostle, said that he didn't understand everything that Paul wrote. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 16, he's referring to Paul and he's referring to his audience. And he says this, as Paul, does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters. There are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. That's encouraging to me, because if Peter can say that Paul writes some things that are hard to understand, I think it's okay for us to say, Paul, this is hard for us to understand. This reading and interpretation is going to take humility. We first have to admit that this is hard to understand, and it doesn't get easier the more you study it. I have countless commentaries on 1 Corinthians, and actually by the end of it, I had more questions than I had answers, and I had more questions that I began with, because there's just so many ways to look at this. The more you look at it, the more questions you have. What may start with just a few questions will lead to more as we get into it. And by the end of it, you may disagree with me, and that's okay, because you can open up 15 different commentaries, and you'll find probably about 15 different ways in which this can be interpreted. But I want to assimilate as much as possible and as concisely as possible. Not only is it difficult to just talk about this and to interpret it, it's very difficult to do it in 30 to 40 minutes that we usually spend here. Otherwise, we could probably spend 3 or 4 nights in just going into this one passage. But one thing we don't want to do is just simply push this aside and say, well, this is hard. Paul, this is just something about their culture, so let's just shove it aside and not really think about it. That's dangerous. We can't do that. And it's really leaving something that is very profitable for us as a church, and we don't want to just throw it away because it's hard to understand. There's some level, we'll have to admit to some of our study that we can't get through everything just because of the sheer volume of material that's out there. Tomes have been written on this one passage, and books have been written on just one Greek word that's found in here, which we'll get to later. But a couple of books that I highly recommend. They're very scholarly, but they're very interesting. Depends how much you like to read, enjoy to read. They can be a short read or a very long read for you. The first one is Paul and Gender by Dr. Cynthia Westfall. It's about a 500-page book, so it depends whether you want to get into that or not. It's very scholarly, very technical, but it is extremely profitable in looking at the difference between veiling and unveiling, because she gets into, in their culture, because not only are we talking about that, but also we're talking about Greco-Roman culture. The Greeks veil at different times than the Romans do in their time. And Muslims veil at different times, and they would have, even though it's the same practice that's being practiced, it can still mean all different things when it is actually veiling is practiced. Another good work is Paul, Women and Wives by Dr. Craig Keener. Both of those books are very good and get it to a different perspective of it. So, in breaking it down, first we'll cover the head covering and worship. In Corinth, some men cover their head as a sign of a higher class. They're very used to that distinction, that stratification in your culture. And a man of a higher class, he would be veiled. So if you Google mostly Roman, some Greek, but mostly Roman times, the men would cover part of their head. So they would have almost kind of like their toga or whatever, like we may have our hoodies today, but it covers part of your head. And that was a showing that you were of a higher class, a higher sort. So if you come in and you really want to bedazzle all of these people at the worship service, what you do as a guy is you cover part of your head, and that's really showing off that you're of a high distinction. And the Corinthians love a high distinction. They love to separate themselves. And it seems as though Paul is telling the men, when they come into the worship service, don't do that. And I think he draws both from the Genesis account, and he draws from nature itself. I think when he refers to nature itself, he may be referring to Greco-Roman nature, or he could be referring to just how the body naturally, with the difference between estrogen and the way the body naturally, as men get older, they can tend to lose hair. And so I think that could be what he's also referring to as well. But he tells the men not to do that. To make everybody, he's wanting to do this great leveling. He's wanting to make everybody even on the same playing field. So there's none of this flashy men coming by and he's veiled and he's really something special. There was none of that going on. Paul didn't want the lower class Christians, although in his mind he wouldn't think that, but he didn't want the poorer Christians to feel ashamed while richer Christians come in. And he wanted everybody to be leveled on the same level in Christ Jesus. And there shouldn't have been a show during the corporate worship service because, and this hasn't changed, corporate worship is all about Jesus. It's all about, and I point to that because it's the cross and it's all about Him. When we come here, it's not about our show. It's not about us. It's not about our actions. We're all here for the same purpose. We're all here to see Him more glorified than ourselves. We're all here to see us become less and Him to become more. And that's why the church is established, and that's what we'll be celebrating for all eternity. Now, for the women covering their head, or veiling, it's a sign of respect. If women come in their culture and they veil, it's a sign that they're married, so it's like a wedding ring for our time. And it's a sign of, I respect my husband. I love him, I honor him, I cherish him. If a woman was married with a man and she didn't do that, it was great disrespect in their culture. It showed that she wanted nothing to do with him. And if a woman didn't do that and they were married, or if a woman came in and didn't veil, it meant usually one of two things, both of them kind of connected. But one, it could mean that she's single. So for some of the guys in the corporate worship experience, it's kind of a big signal of, hey, she's available, that she's not married yet. But for some of them, and I think you see this in 1 Timothy, but you know how Paul condemns the elaborate hairdressings and things like that. He mentions that some women put in gold and everything like that, and silver and all these great things. Because in their time, doing such meant that you were promiscuous, meant that you were in the line of prostitution. And so Paul didn't want any of that going on in Ephesus, and then here in Corinth, he didn't want any of that going on. But it's interesting, Paul tells women, and this is absolutely sui generis, meaning that it's unlike anything else in their culture. Paul wanted all women, when they came in, to veil, and all men to unveil. Made them all on the same playing field. Nowhere else could a woman go who was single and could she veil. It just wasn't appropriate in their culture. It just wasn't something that you did. You only veil when you have a husband, and it shows that you have protection, that you're provided for. And if you didn't have a veil in their times, it meant all of the other kind of implications. It didn't mean that. So for Paul to say that when women come into the worship gathering, they all veil, it meant two things. It meant that all women were to be treated on the same playing field. All women were treated with respect. All women were to have a level of modesty as well. And I think this was the bigger issue too, is because of their sexual identity there in Corinth. All women were also protected at their time. Paul was calling for all women to be protected. We think that this is a form of Paul demeaning women. I think the exact opposite. Because in their time, if a woman is uncovered and you kind of know where to go, I'm trying to think how to say this, but for some men to go to a certain gathering and to see certain women who are not veiled, they kind of know which ones to mostly pester, if that makes any sense. And so this is kind of Paul's way to protect all women in their culture. Because at their time, you really wouldn't have known who was married and who wasn't. It didn't mean that necessarily that they sat next to each other, because they may not have. In some corporate settings, mostly probably they didn't. But it made everybody the same. Every woman was veiled. There was no woman who you could pick out, okay, single, married, or protected, provided for, not provided, not protected. And Paul wanted to make sure that all women were protected. They were all the same here in their time. One of the difficult parts is, in the Greek, Paul writes in the feminine when he's talking about wives, but it can also be translated as women. So is Paul talking about wives here, or just women in general? And when he's talking about masculine, could be talking about the husband, or he could be just talking about mankind in general. And so that's what makes it also kind of difficult to translate. Because if Paul means husband and wife, this is a respect issue. Paul doesn't want spouses disrespecting each other. But if it's talking about general men and women, he doesn't, of course, still wants respect, but it's generally all men and all women respecting each other in their relationships. But this could be referring to wives being told to honor and not shame their husbands. Second, what does Paul mean of the word head? Because he uses that term a lot here. And he goes through this succession where he says that man is the head of woman, and Christ is the head of man, and God is the head of Christ, referring to the Trinity, God the Father and God the Son. In verse 3, he says the head of every man is Christ, the head of every woman is her husband, or every woman is man. And then third, the head of Christ is God. And the Greek word that he uses here is kephele. And if you've done any biblical study of this word, it is a very contentious word. Kephele can mean a lot of different things. Particularly, there's two things that this is usually translated. This can mean source, like it's an originator, something originates from something else. It's usually used in like the beginning of a river or a fountain, or even in food types, something is a source from something else. Or it could mean authority. Now, that could make this mean slightly different things depending upon how you look at it, whether this is a source or whether this is a form of authority. And entire books have been written on just this one Greek word. The problem is, you can't be dogmatic about it. I don't think you can be dogmatic about it, because it can really mean both things. You do a Bible study of this word, it shows up in both instances. It shows up with one in authority, and then it shows up also as something as being the originator of something. So this could look like a hierarchical lens, and I don't have a cool little diagram. I just wrote something for myself to display. But it would mean that Christ is in authority above man, and husband in authority above wife, or man in authority above woman, and then Christ in authority, or God in above authority above Christ, which would mean that there's a hierarchy in the Trinity, God the Father and God the Son. Or it could mean a form of succession, meaning God the Father in the terms of begotten for God the Son, since God the Son has never had a beginning, but his flesh had a beginning, but he's always in his pre-incarnate, co-eternal, and co-deity with the Father, but his incarnation did have a beginning. And so it could be referring to that. And then Christ is in a succession, the creator of man, and then man through his rib is the creator of woman, as woman was created from Adam's side. That's clear as mud, right? So that's about as clear as we can kind of make the beginning part without spending an hour or two and just getting to some of the detailed words. Christ's human nature had a beginning, though God the Son and God the Father are co-eternal and co-equal, worthy of both the same amount of worship. And here Paul grounds his theology of gender in the Genesis account. When he says that man is made in the image of God, he goes on to say that male and female he created them. So image of God has something distinct within our genders. And that's a big thing right now, is the gender battle, the gender distinction, and what all that means. And God has given our image as it reflects him in our gender. And male and female, as we are created in those two genders, it's said to reflect the image of God. Now, God himself doesn't have a gender, but in the scripture it's usually used in the masculine, just not in the Latin Vulgate, but in most Greek and Hebrew translations. But I forgot where I was going with that. As Paul grounds his gender account in the Genesis story, we have something to reflect back of what it means to be the image of God. So if we have such a hard time with understanding what our gender is, we have such a hard time of describing what the image of God is and what that looks like as it's reflected, and as we've been created to do, is to reflect God. Third, there is this great leveling. Verses 11 and 12. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. That would have been big in their culture. And just as much as for some church culture, that can be as big as us. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. He makes this great leveling. In their culture, they're used to that caste system. They're used to the stratification. But Paul casts them both down and makes them both equal. Both woman and man are seen praying and prophesying here in chapter 11. This is the biggest thing to me. He said when a woman prophesies, she should be veiled, so she should be showing honor and respect to her husband. But he doesn't prohibit a woman from praying and prophesying in that. And we'll get to what prophesying looks like later in chapter 12 and mainly in chapter 14. But I love that verse because they both had that same right. And Paul later on defines the function of prophecy in chapter 14. I want to read that. Chapter 14, verses 3 and 5. Paul writes about the beautiful function of what the gift of prophecy is like. It says, on the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. That's the filter for the gift of prophecy. Upbuilding, encouragement, and consolation. So if you may hear some people say that they have the gift of prophecy, they're prophetic, they're prophets, or whatever, and they don't have those three qualities about the prophecy, then they're not going according to Scripture. Those are the three qualifications. If it's not upbuilding someone, if it's not encouraging someone, if it's not consoling someone, they are not in the prophetic ministry that the New Testament has. The one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the entire church. Now I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so the church may be built up. And Peter quotes prophecy of Joel that both sons and daughters will prophesy. Both male and female servants will have God's Spirit poured out upon them. Now, I know in this church that may not be such a big of a deal. Where I come from, our previous church, my goodness, these are some liberating verses. I particularly went to one board member's house, and I thought it was going to be, he invited me and his wife invited me to come over and have a barbecue, come and sit out on a nice patio, and I thought this was going to be a nice time to get to know him and everything. It was really a board meeting, side by side with just me. And the wife wanted to tell me how no women should be serving in the church. They should, and they built this system. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. It's like I've seen 1,000,001 of these, but anyway. And they built this system where, you have people, this person's above this person's above this person, and there's this big hierarchy. And then we have these volunteer sheets. You write down what you want to volunteer for. So we had a few women write down that they wanted to volunteer to pass around tithes and offerings, and they want to pass around communion. At that church, we had communion every single week. And I particularly remember her holding up this chart, and a woman at our church who has devoted most of her life to that church and has done more things behind the screen than countless other people. But she had her name there, and she said she should know her place. And so she picked up a pen and she scratched off her name off of there. She said, women do not pass communion. And I remember thinking, oh my. I don't know what to do there. And, chapter and verse. Then she picked up the pen of her having her name there for tithes and offering. She said, women have no place in passing out tithes and offerings. And even though they were the biggest givers of the church, widows supported that church. And I thought, I don't know what to do to help you. We are one in Christ. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. If you want to make a big argument about a woman shouldn't be teaching and preaching, whatever, I'll disagree with you on that too. But
wow. Look up Priscilla.
Yeah. But out of all places, like, how can you take away this? And I remember sitting down with that woman, telling her that her name has been scratched off from serving in this way, and she was devastated. And it broke me, and it broke us, part of a church, and we isolated so many women from that church because the leaders there, all board members, all male, and they wanted nothing. They just wanted women to cook and to clean, and that was the woman's place at that church. And I thought of this verse. Paul said that when women get up and prophesy, when women get up and upbuild and encourage and console, the only qualification that Paul gave there is that she should have been veiled. So basically that she should have a right relationship with her husband. That was the only qualification he gave. Paul said that they should be in the middle of upbuilding, encouraging, and consolation. And if that's not teaching, I don't know what is. If that's not a part of teaching ministry, then I don't know what that qualifies as. I didn't mean to spend as much time on that subject, but it just means a lot to me at where we're at now, and knowing that that's not an issue here.
Praise God.
Yeah, it was such a big issue there, and I remember we had a meeting, 2-3 hour meeting as a church, not a board meeting, a 2 to 3 hour meeting as a church, and they were trying to define at what age can a woman teach Sunday school to children, because should we have the male children there because they're men? Well, they're not men. And then you have one guy get up, no, they're not men yet. So it's not breaking that commandment in their eyes. And so, well, when do they become men? So should we not have a woman teach them at the age of 13, 12? Well, some mature faster than others. So what? And it broke down to, the saying that you beat a horse into glue? Man, we made an entire Elmer factory there. Wow. Just from all the horses that we tried to beat over and over again. And I just wanted to scream, what does it matter? I mean, it's ridiculous. Okay, fourth. Paul mentions angels.
Moving on.
Yeah, moving on. I can make an entire message just on that. Fourth, why does Paul mention angels in verse 10? So this is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. He throws in that one verse, and then he goes back to it, and then doesn't mention anything else about it. Now, in the Greek, angelos could mean angelic creature, or it can mean a messenger, as in some sort of church authority as well. So this could be meaning that angels are present in our worship service, and I believe that angels are present with us as we worship the Lord, as we uplift his name, that it's not just us, because it can feel lonely, just us, with our hymnal, or just with our words, and there may not be very many voices, but we're surrounded by the angelic voices, and we may not be able to hear them. I don't know if that's a spiritual gift or not. It'd be great if it was, but we're not able to hear it. But we have to believe in faith that they're still there. We have to believe in faith that we're enjoined in this thousands and thousands of year-long song that goes out to the Lamb. Or Paul may be referring to human messengers, that you want to be respectful because those who are in the church are going to go back and they're going to report whether this church is disobedient or not. I think the most probable is that Paul is saying you want to be respectful because you are worshiping where angels are trotting. You're worshiping where there's it's much higher, it's elevated than, and it may not feel very elevated sometimes for us. We may have had a very difficult morning, And I know that feeling, walking through that door, and Harper's been like, just really upset or something, and I know what that's like. And then you get in here and you have to turn on this switch, and you have to turn on this worship mode, and that can be difficult. But like I said, it's by faith that we believe that something else is going on other than what we can just see, other than maybe we just experience. There's something by faith that there's elevation going on here. Lastly, there's points of application. I think this is a further argument of Paul saying that Christians should be peaceful and loving, that we should not want to cause each other to stumble. And that's what the whole veiling thing, I think, was about, is seeing us all as we are all on the same playing field. We are all saved by grace. There's nothing, one of us that has something over the other. The only reason why we're saved in Jesus is because of his mercy. There's nothing about us that, I'm just so special, I'm just so good that Jesus had to save me. Shame on us if we ever think that.
That sounds absurd. What do you say?
Yeah. Boy, aren't you glad, God, that you have me a part of your kingdom? You sure are lucky. So we remember to respect each other. We remember to respect both genders. We remember the spiritual nature and purpose of the church. As angels are gathered with us to worship, the church should worship in spirit and in truth. And then lastly, both men and women have a place in the corporate prayer and prophetic life of the church. I've had some women give me some prophetic words, and I'm really looking forward to getting to the topic of prophecy when we get into it, because there has been, in this day and age, about 10 years ago, I think there was a big thing on tongues, and there was so many misunderstandings of teaching on that. And I think today it's prophecy. There's just so many people that get up, thus saith the Lord, and feel as though that's commanded upon people. And they feel as though they can just make commandments out of thin air and just say all kinds of crazy stuff, and then it doesn't turn out. And then they have to go back on their word. Like, well, if that's a word of the Lord, I guarantee you it's not going to be wrong. But I've had some very kind, sweet women and give me very encouraging words through the prophetic life of what they've spoken into me. And I hope that's the same for all of us, both men and women, giving us prophetic life through their ministry.